Obviously, our attention was focused on China here, but I think there's other folks getting involved in this space as well. China is not the only one. The seabed is no longer just this common heritage of mankind to be protected. It's also a potential battle space for some of the world's biggest political actors.
Welcome to the Elements of Deep Sea Mining podcast. Kara Fox and Elizabeth Alberts. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So, Kara Fox is a London-based CNN reporter and investigative journalist. Are you covering security and geopolitics? How do you describe your beat, Kara?
I cover a wide range of subjects. Geopolitics and security and conflict definitely fall under those, and I think most relevant for the conflict. But I also cover gender and climate.
And Elizabeth, you and I met, I guess, just over a year ago at a deep sea mining conference. So I know you cover the deep sea mining beat more specifically. You're a senior staff writer at Mongabay's Ocean Desk. And just maybe one or two sentences to introduce what you focus on journalistically.
Well, over the past year and a half, I've been focusing just on deep sea mining with my fellowship at the Pulitzer Center. Otherwise, I cover a wide range of ocean issues, whether it's fisheries or the impacts of climate change on the ocean, marine biodiversity. Yeah, you name it. Anything to do with the ocean.
Yeah. So then we're just going to hop straight in, and we're going to try to do this quicker than my usual podcast schedule. So you two, along with others, I'm sure, produced this recent report titled China's Growing Influence in the Pacific is 5,000 meters deep. Deep sea mining is its latest battlefield. This was published on CNN World. And I guess the kind of takeaway for me from this is that, what you kind of found as I read it is China is using its deep sea mining contracts sort of as cover for systematic seafloor mapping with military applications. So first of all, is that a fair read, a fair summary of what you guys produced?
Just to say also to Elizabeth, as piece, so we co-publish. So there's a piece on CNN and there's a piece on Mongabay as well. Both of the pieces approach the subject as you have outlined it really well. But Mongabay's piece takes a stronger environmental angle, while CNN really dives deeper into some of the geopolitics, particularly around the South China Sea. But I think that's a good take from a good read. In short, I think, the seabed is no longer just this common heritage of mankind to be protected. It's also a potential battle space for some of the world's biggest political actors. Obviously, our attention was focused on China here, but I think as you previewed for your audience as well, that, there's other folks getting involved in this space as well. And China is not the only one.
Elizabeth, do you have anything to add on kind of framing of the work you guys did?
I think Kara summed it up well, but I'll just say that, I think our investigation really showed that this industry has very strong geopolitical ties, perhaps more than a lot of people realize, and that there's a lot more going on behind the scenes than what we might see.
Yeah. And this is something that I think is getting more, from my perception of the deep sea mining conversation, getting more attention. I know that you, Elizabeth, published a piece a while ago just kind of naming how the conversation, the narrative around deep sea mining has shifted from being really specifically energy transition into more geopolitics and security around just the messaging. And I feel like along with that has come a lot of discussion of what people are doing in their deep sea mining research. So one of the terms here that I guess people kind of classify this under is dual use. Is that a term that you guys kind of embrace, and can maybe, Kara, can you just kind of explain what that refers to?
Yeah, so the dual use angle is hitting on this civilian military fusion policy, which is at the heart of China's blueprint around oceans in many ways. And so the dual use angle, we had seen this idea of dual use, this thesis, or lots of China experts talking about China's oceanographic fleet working not just in a scientific capacity, but also working for its military in other capacities previously. CSIS had laid the foundations for an amazing project back in 2024 that looked at some of China's oceanographic fleet in the Indian Ocean, which we looked at. Darshana Baruha had done some work looking at this space as well that was really informative to the approach that we also wanted to take about whether or not we could apply that same thesis to China's deep sea mining fleet.
Mhm.
And so we that's, I guess you weren't really asking, but the dual use question was the hypothesis that we had from the beginning. And we were able to underline some of our findings with all of those experts that had also not just looked in the deep sea mining space, but in the wider oceanographic space that China has. Elizabeth?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I was going to mention CSIS, which had informed our research. And I guess we started also looking at what was happening in the Cook Islands. There was the agreement signed between China and the Cook Islands very shortly after Trump took office. And things started heating up there very quickly. There was this competition playing out between China and the US with deep sea mining. So we started looking there. And I think initially we were thinking of, focusing a story on that. But that led us to take a closer look at what China was doing, since China is such a leader in terms of in deep sea mining, especially through the ISA. So, but yeah, and as Kara said, there has been a lot of research on the dual use, China's dual use vessels, but no one that we had seen had specifically looked at China's deep sea mining vessels. I mean, China has oceanographic vessels that they're not just doing deep sea mining, obviously, but we figured out the ones that were doing deep sea mining over the last 5 years. So we think our stories was quite unique in that way.
Yeah. So you guys came at this trying to put more context around this dual use narrative that you've seen showing up. And you're right, the kind of competition between the US and China, specifically in the Cook Islands, is one of the places that this has appeared, at least on my radar, as someone who focuses on deep sea mining. So then maybe just give, so for people who haven't checked out the story yet, give us an overview of how you approached this reporting wise, the method that you took, which I think a lot of people, just go ahead and tell us how you went at it.
I think we're both smiling because there was a lot of start and stop. I think with any huge piece that has rolling deadlines and changes in the geopolitical landscape and changes within the industry, we started and stopped many times with many different ideas before we were able to land here. But in short, we, started by trying to identify which of the 40 plus vessels in China's blue water fleet were operating in deep sea mining contracted areas. And so that was a task on its own. The way that we did that was we broke down 5 years. We looked at 5 years of data from marine traffic initially and looked at all of the vessels in the fleet that appeared to have done some work there. So we matched whether or not any of those vessels had gone to deep sea mining areas for a considerable amount of time or had spent any time that appeared to look like research to weed out the 8 that we settled on eventually out of the 40 plus. We also used open source verification and leaned on our fantastic colleagues, Chinese speaking colleagues, to help us look at what was publicly available from the China facing to verify that this was indeed the case. And then from there, we worked through a series of structures to sort of arrive at our to apply our methodology. So we looked whether or not any of those vessels had gone to military ports before or after they had done any of their deep sea mining work. We had looked to see whether or not any of those vessels had loitered or spent time that appeared interesting in other countries' EEZs with or without their permission. We had looked at the specific movements within the deep sea mining contracted areas, and also tried to see what was going on in those areas through verified sources as well, to kind of create a bigger picture as to what was going on. And of course, we also engaged with some fantastic folks over at Starboard who helped us look deeper into where some of those vessels were moving around undersea cables as well.
Starboard is a maritime data analysis company.
That's
Is that right?
correct. Yeah, they're based out of New Zealand.
How did you guys get together on this? Like, is this what's the backstory on how
did we
CNN
start to
and
work
Mongabay?
together?
Yeah.
Oh, a Mongabay colleague of mine, Eric Hoffner, introduced us after he met Kara at Society of Environmental Journalism conference. That's when Kara was doing her TED Scripts fellowship. I wasn't there, but apparently he said to you, like, once he knew you were interested in deep sea mining, he said you should talk to Elizabeth, and he said to me, you should talk to Kara. Yeah, we connected and realized that we had a lot of shared interests and a reporting interest, and decided to join forces for for a big story for the Pulitzer Center.
It's been a very organic working relationship. It's been great.
I guess my big question about this is just kind of, how surprised should we be by the fact that this dual use research is going on in China's case specifically? And then also, like, is everybody doing this? Like, how exceptional is China?
I think I could start with the first one, and then we could go back. Maybe Elizabeth could tackle this, the second, or the other way around. I mean, I think ultimately, like, our focus was China. Our job is not to point the finger and say we should be concerned or not concerned, but rather to present what we've been able to find. I mean, I think China isn't the boogeyman here. As you say, like, every major maritime power uses oceanographic data for their advantage militarily. The U.S. Navy and NOAA have been data sharing for decades, as far as we understand. So China isn't inventing something new here. I think what's different is that China is the only ones with the world's largest fleet, and they have an explicit civil military fusion mandate. So that essentially turns these vessels into a potential recon network. And they're not necessarily hiding that. When we talk about concern, I guess I know that I just said it's not really our job to say whether or not we should be concerned. I think something that is interesting is that, if we're talking about minerals, and we're also seeing patterns where conversations around a potential Taiwan takeover are coming into play within this space where we think we're talking about minerals. That's interesting to think about. There's other reporting that suggests that it's not just within the deep sea mining fleet capacity, that we could see some of those patterns unfolding in the South China Sea. I don't want to sound alarmist about Taiwan, but I do think that those patterns are worth monitoring and looking at. And of course, there's the obvious implications, which I think Elizabeth could probably do a better job of talking about, for the environment. Like, any military application in any industry is not, is not great for the environment. And so I think, a combination of considering what the militarization of deep sea mining might look like for our oceans is important.
So what you found was, in addition to kind of doing what we would expect deep sea mining research vessels to do, which is to go out into a deep sea, a potential contract area, and sort of do grid pattern monitoring and data gathering, they went to a number of areas that kind of had much more explicitly military strategic uses, applications. And then so there's kind of suggestions of things like they would be placing or just doing monitoring for potential submarine traffic, or trying to find the sound signatures of the submarine. And talking to some of the military strategic people that you interviewed for this, I guess, number one, just how aware of this were they? Did anybody find this surprising, or was this just kind of, this is par for the course from their perspective, and this is more kind of informing the public of the sort of thing that people in strategic realms are already aware of?
I don't think that was surprising to any of, none of the analysts that we spoke to seemed to express surprise. I mean, as I said earlier, some of the analysts were looking at deep sea mining in particular, but they hadn't necessarily, pinpointed down on deep sea mining vessels in particular. They're very aware of this dual use and that China is using vessels for research, and they're also doing, there's military objectives to their expeditions.
And this is another thing that I kind of think is interesting here is, so for this podcast audience is people who see a lot of things through a deep sea mining lens. When we think of whatever dual use deep sea mining and military applications, we're not all that surprised because this has been in discussion. We're kind of aware of the security narrative happening around deep sea mining. But yeah, so it's interesting that you say the reverse of this is maybe some of where the story would be for like whatever normies. People who don't think so much about deep sea mining is like, okay, there's this new industry. It's not super well known and it is being exploited in this. It has a role to play in this bigger geopolitical story that everyone is more aware of.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think, we didn't just speak to naval experts. We spoke to a lot, folks in civil society and academics. And the findings were not surprising, or even like some of the specific routes and the methodology that we shared with some of our experts weren't necessarily as surprising as much as like underpinning their thought, like their ideas about all of this anyway, which on some level was good for us because it helped us feel extremely confident in putting out the stories that we did. I mean, I think you had asked previously, not on this podcast, but you had, when we were speaking off of the podcast, you had, asked about a lot of our language is couched in experts say, and I think that's really important because ultimately we don't know, and China isn't going to say this is what we're doing. It's not within their interest to do so, and I don't think the U.S. would either. Any large power, it's not in their interest to talk about what their what military edge they have. So to hear from experts that they found our thesis strong, even though there would be times, for example, that there would be certain routes or certain things that we had thought were outliers or something to highlight, where certain experts would say, I actually don't, I think I think it's better to look here. Maybe this isn't something important. The vast majority of them would come back to the same conclusion on most of the things that we were highlighting.
Yeah, obviously our investigation was, had a very strong geopolitical angle to it. And, but we also spoke to a lot of scientists and NGOs about the environmental impact of this and this increasing militarization of the industry. They're saying it could have a very strong impact on the environment. We're going into uncharted territory here. While there has been a lot of research conducted and into the deep sea there and the impacts of mining, there is still a lot that is unknown. Very few mining tests have taken place. It's a very new industry, and there has been a lot of discussion about the difficulties of operating very heavy machinery down thousands of meters below the surface of the ocean. There's, I think some of my previous reporting also talked about the financial challenges of operating this industry. Yeah. But yes, we definitely didn't want the environmental argument to get lost in this investigation because it is a very important part of it. There might be some that say, yes, well, see what China is doing. We should probably do the same if this is becoming like a thing. But I think, it is very important to remember that these are fragile ecosystems that could be, badly.
It's one of the frustrating things, I think, just about the general increase in security narrative in the news generally, is it's definitely pushing down and overriding environmental. I hear people say, I don't have time to think about climate change anymore because conflict is becoming so prominent. So I think it's great to keep both of those things in mind and just absolutely emphasize that just because there's dual use here doesn't totally shift the focus away from the other important aspects of the deep sea mining conversation. I guess maybe if I only get one more question here, it's where else does this reporting that you've done so far go? I mean, I guess you must have a bunch more information that didn't get into the publications. And then are there future follow-ups here, or what happens with everything you've learned?
What we publish is the tip of the iceberg. I do think, it'll be interesting to see as conversations around regulation continue, what China continues to do. Like, we now know which vessels are big actors, and so we can continue to look at what they're doing with the same methodology. We don't, I think how the U.S. plays into all of this is really interesting right now, and I think that for us, if we were to go forward with some additional work around this, moving towards the U.S. pivot and looking more deeply into some of the things that we talked about earlier in terms of any applications that might be of interest to the U.S. in this industry would be something that we would like to look at. But yeah, I mean, the sky's the limit really with this. There's so much movement in this industry. And I think, as you said, the normies out there, which are not your audience, but the normies don't really know about this industry. Like, most people, when we published, didn't know that this industry had even started. From my perspective, from our audience, in my newsroom. So it's the base level of knowledge is, I'd say, like from an audience perspective, is still quite low out there, and there's appetite for learning more on this, and particularly around that push and pull between the U.S. and China.
And I just also want to give a shout out to the Deep Sea Mining Watch tool, which was launched actually during our investigation, because that is, we relied on that as well. And I think that the vessel tracking that we did, you could apply the same kind of methodology and look at other countries' fleets or ships that are operating for various countries and to see what is happening. So that's a great tool for any journalist to use to.
Or anyone, really. Yeah. I mean, it's
such
huge shout out to the Deep Sea Mining Watch folks. They also use marine traffic data, which we also used. And we heavily relied on their tool once it was released to check some of our findings or to backstop some of the things we were looking at. And anyone can use it. So if you have an interest in deep sea mining and an IMO number or a name, you can do this work yourself, which I think is what's so interesting and liberating around all this work. Like, all the information is really out there. It's just spending the time putting all the pieces together.
Okay, well, I'll put links to both of the stories and to the Deep Sea Mining Watch tool in the show notes. And I guess, thanks both of you for turning your attentional resources to this and for producing such an interesting story and for spending your time with me.
Thanks for having
me.